Hello everyone and welcome back to Kobean History. In today's video of medieval professions we will go over the winemakers. We will cover a variety of topics regarding winemaking and wine consumption throughout the ages, such as the meaning behind wine, who made it, who consumed it, what medieval wine tasted like, how it was stored, the actual process of making wine, and at the end of the video I will go into more detail about the different terms for the professions within the winemaking industry. 2000 years ago some believed that the gods actually lived inside of the grapes, so by harvesting them and creating wine they transcended their usual lives and were able to commune with the gods. As the influence of the church grew, they began to restrict the use of sacred wine and created a clear distinction between sacred and secular wine. Now sacred wine was used to commune with the gods, atone for sins and bring forgiveness, which by the way is the origins of communion. On the other hand, secular wine didn't have any spiritual meaning, and that's what the everyday person would drink for fun and nourishment. A few great advantages of grapes opposed to other produce plants is that they require less water and they can grow in harsher environments such as rocky hillsides. Outside of the church there was an abundance of secular wine. Its most important function was to provide nourishment to those who drank it for the calories it contains. And the alcohol content of wine also killed bacteria, making it one of the safest beverages to consume, especially compared to water, which could be riddled with bacteria and disease. The largest providers of wine were often priests, monks, friars, and nuns from the Catholic Church, as they cultivated, planted, harvested, and fermented the grapes. Benedictine and Cistercian monks played a large role in the development of European viniculture, which is a fancy word for the cultivation of grapevines for winemaking. Cistercians were also known for their large knowledge of the process of winemaking, and they even provided training to their congregation on how to grow grapevines and make wine. Medieval kings and lords often owned their own vineyards to create their own wine, but they would also give some of this land to the church. Ordinary people were often very involved in the process of winemaking, especially in the countryside where the whole family, including children, would work on vineyards picking and processing grapes. England, out of all places, was a leader in grape growing and winemaking during the Middle Ages, and at the end of the 11th century it is said that there were 50 vineyards in the south of the country, and these vineyards prospered for over 300 years. At this time the English also controlled the area of Bordeaux in France, which developed a thriving wine industry due to the combination of the weather and the soil they had there, which was inhospitable for most other types of agriculture. In the mid-1500s there was a mini ice age, which reduced the production of the English vineyards drastically. This allowed the Burgundy and the now French Bordeaux regions, as well as the German Rhine Valley, to emerge as prominent winemaking regions. Most accounts of the flavor of medieval wine showed that it was quite different to the wine we produce nowadays, with accounts describing that wine tasted horrible. This might be because unlike today, wine was not stored in glass wine bottles with corks, as neither had been invented at the time. The most expensive time of the year to buy wine would have been in autumn, as the wine was still young and fruity and still contained the preservative fizz of carbon dioxide. Wine would have been stored in barrels and casks, and this would cause the wine to rapidly deteriorate, ruining its taste and aroma, causing most medieval wines to taste and smell much worse than today's standard. Historians say that even the better quality wines made in Europe would have been inferior to the wine of the ancient Romans and Greek, as these would have often been infused with resin and stored in clay vessels, which protected the wine better. During the Middle Ages, various remedies were created to either preserve or revive a wine. The most popular method to preserve wine was to pour olive oil over the wine to create a film layer that would float on top. A popular French recipe for reviving wine is to soak and then boil wheat in water and then throw the mixture into a cask filled with sour wine, and if this didn't work, you were meant to add a basket of well-washed sand. It's not a surprise that most people didn't use this method, so instead they would try and mask the flavor by adding spices, honey and herbs. The lower classes often stored their wine in animal hides, which added a rancid flavor to the existing vinegary taste, but people often looked past this as it was safer to drink than water, though some people would mix wine with water to extend the amount they had. It's also noted that some people couldn't even afford wine, so they would drink water mixed with grape pomace. Pomace being a byproduct of winemaking, consisting of the pressed skins, stems, seeds and pulp of the grapes. Although most of the wine was water diluted, causing it to have a relatively low alcohol level, it wasn't uncommon for people to be at least a little intoxicated, especially during the summer months when the weather was hotter, causing people to drink more. And a fun thing the people of that time did was attribute animals with the different stages of intoxication. Mild is a sheep, moderate a lion, high was an ape, and extreme a hog. Just as a disclaimer, I want to mention that this doesn't mean that people in the Middle Ages were just walking around drunk all the time. This was definitely not the case, because otherwise they wouldn't have gotten any work done. But I just wanted to make that point clear, because I've heard that argument being thrown out there on the internet. Mulled wine was first recorded in Rome during the 2nd century, and it remains a popular festive drink to this day, especially during the Christmas period. The medieval mulled wine recipes produce a hearty drink, rich in spices but without the same level of sweetness that the modern mulled wine has. Yet they would still have used honey to give the wine some sweetness. The main ingredients of mulled wine during the Middle Ages would be an inexpensive red wine, ginger, cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, cardamom, honey, dried cherries, raisins and almonds. So as you can see from all these different ingredients, there are lots of spices which would have made it an expensive treat reserved for the Christmas celebrations. It wouldn't be until the 17th century that glass wine bottles with cork stoppers were introduced. And even then, the vast majority of wines was still stored and transported in barrels well into the 20th century. The advantages of using corked bottles was that they were better for long-term storage and aging. Glass wine bottles at first posed a problem as they were easily broken, which made it harder to transport. Over time, advances made in the glassmaking industry allowed for production of thicker and harder to break glass, and eventually it came to a point where it was safe to store and transport wines in glass bottles. Early wine bottles had a flat bottom and shorter necks. Over time the wine bottles became taller and the bottom of the bottle became smaller, which made the bottle sturdier. The bottom of the bottle would also get an indentation which was spherical, which distributed the weight of the wine inside, which made it harder for the bottom of the bottle to break under the pressure of the liquid inside. And by around the 1820s we see wine bottles with a similar shape to the modern wine bottles. Glass wine bottles were still seen as a hazard though, because in Britain it was illegal to sell wine in a bottle from 1636 until 1860, And if you were a wealthy wine drinker, you would often own your own bottles, which you then had to ship to your vintner of choice. So they would sell you that wine and put it in your bottles, but you already owned the bottle, so it wouldn't violate that law. Now we will go over the process of making wine. First, the grapes would be harvested, and this would be done by different members of the community, including children, as they had smaller and nimble hands to reach through the vines. After that, the grapes are flattened and fermented for 1 to 2 weeks. This can be done using a wine press, or you can also use your feet to stomp the grapes. This method is also known as pigeage, and I will talk more about that later on in the video. After this is done, the juice is moved into different containers where the yeast will convert the sugars into alcohol. This is also when the wine becomes transparent, with the color of wine coming from the skins of the grapes. Usually with white wine, these are removed early in the process, but with red wine they are left in longer so the wine can absorb more of the chemicals and the tannins. Finally, the wine can either be poured into oak barrels for aging or placed into various containers to be sold and drunk. Pigeage is the French word for pressing down, which refers to the traditional process of stomping on the grapes in an open area or a vat, depictions of which you might be familiar with. When you see this, you might think they did this to extract the juices from the grapes. And yes, you would be right, they are extracting the juices from the wine here, but extracting the wine isn't the main reason why pigeage is done. They actually do this to prevent the wine from becoming too acidic. The layers of skin and other solids from grapes are called caps, and in a vat of crushed grapes, these tend to float to the top while the juice is below it. If the caps are just left to float on top of the juice, acidic compounds will start to form in them, making the wine acidic. But if these caps are constantly mixed with the juice below, these acidic compounds won't have time to form. Caps are also a good source of tannins. This is a yellow-brown bitter-tasting organic substance which through this process of pigeage is also mixed into the juice. And this is important because tannins act like a natural antioxidant which protects the wine. So those were the original reasons why pigeage was done. So now we will go over some terms for professions in the winemaking industry, and we will also go into the etymology behind them. And we will start with the grape farmers, so the people who grew the grapes in order to make wine. I found 2 terms referring to this profession. The first is the Vineroon. From what I could find, this is a less common term, and the next one I will mention was more widely used from what I could find. And that next term is the Vintager. So the term Vintager comes from the word vintage. Vintage is a late Middle English word, and it comes from the earlier word vintage, that in turn coming from the Old French vendange, and then in turn coming from the Latin vendemmia, and that being made up of the Latin words for wine and remove. The next term we have is regarding the making and selling of wine, this term being the Vintner. I've also seen it spelled as Vinter, but I believe this is a spelling mistake made somewhere along the lines, and from what I could find, the term Vinter is most commonly used in last names, originating from the correct term Vintner. Also, the vatman is a term that also can be referred to a person fermenting wine in barrels. Originally, the term Vintner meant a person who makes wine, but also wine cellars are also referred to as vintners, and nowadays when you use the term Vintner, it usually refers to a cellar of wine. It is a late Middle English word, coming from the Anglo-French word viniter, a term coming from the Old French vinetier, meaning wine merchant or grape harvester, that coming from the medieval Latin term vinitarius, which is a wine dealer, and that coming from the Latin terms vinitum and vinum, meaning vineyard and wine respectively. Thanks for watching, I hope you've enjoyed. If you're interested in more medieval professions, you can find the link to the playlist on screen right now. Or if you're interested in history as a whole, you can check out my channel to find a wider variety of topics. I want to thank my patrons for their support, and especially my $15 patron Parker Dye.